So, good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Before we begin our show, I'd like to say thank you for tuning in. It means a lot to me that you're here listening to this program. I also want to wish all of you a very happy Martin Luther King Jr. birthday. Remarkable man, and that is going to be the conversation we're going to have today. But thank you for tuning in. If you like what you hear, and I hope you do, I hope you pass it on to friends and family. We're building an audience, and the reason we're building an audience is not for me, it's for the wonderful people that I get to bring on my show on a frequent basis. So thank you for tuning in. So with that said, it is a tremendous pleasure to welcome today an individual who has done a lot of things. He has been a professor at Stanford University in the Department of History for 43 years, now retired. He also, and relevant to this conversation and relative to this particular day, he was the editor for the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. And with that in mind, it is a great pleasure to welcome to the Hamilton Review today, Dr. Clayborne Carson. Dr. Carson, such an honor to have you on my show today.
It's great to be with you.
So I like to begin every show with you introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your background, your life. What were the main points along your life that caused you to end up as a history professor, and maybe more to the point that allowed you to be the one elected to write this incredible autobiography of Dr. King. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to you and let you take it from there. So Dr. Carson, you're on.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that it surprised me in the sense that it was not that I had a career goal of being the editor for Martin Luther King. I think it was rather I grew up in a small town in New Mexico. Some of you have heard of it, Los Alamos, New Mexico. My father was a security inspector there. Um, and, and one of the things that happens in Los Alamos is that it was an isolated city. You had to show a pass to get in it. It was the place where the atomic bomb was built. And that really shaped my early life. I think even now I have a leaning toward the sciences and technology. Um, so it was kind of surprising in some respects that I ended up as a historian. It's not usually the background that leads to that. Or growing up in a pretty much all white small town doesn't really prepare you for becoming a historian of the civil rights movement. But I think that the way I would look at it is that I became curious about the world outside of Los Alamos and wanting to know more about it. Um, and and I had that chance when I went off to college. And I soon found myself, in part because I was usually the only Black person in the class, uh, that I needed to know more about what was going on at that time. And we're talking about the early 1960s. And I had heard about um, the bus boycott in Montgomery, about the freedom rides, about the sit-ins. And at least the last two of these events were people my own age. And I wanted to be closer to that. I wanted to understand what that was all about. And it seemed like that was a place where young people such as myself could find a place.
Yeah.
And when I went off to live in Los Angeles and go to UCLA, I had lots of opportunities to do that. And
So
and
you went from Los Alamos. Did you graduate from Los Alamos High School and then you went to UCLA?
I went initially to the University of New Mexico, and then I spent a couple of years there, and then I ended up in Los Alamos for a variety of reasons. We don't need to get into all the reasons, but I wanted to visit my elder sister, uh, older sister in Los Angeles, And once I was there, I realized that one thing I'd like to do is write. And I was curious about a subject, I would ask questions. And there was already a civil rights movement going on in Los Angeles. And the beginning of my career was really going up to them, having the nerve to go up and say, "Can I write an article on you?"
Yeah,
And it I remember this person, Woody Coleman, who had a group uh, called the Nonviolent Action Committee. I think it was Operation Bootstrap at that time.
yeah,
And he said, and I tried to sweeten the deal by saying that we could publish something that could kind of combine your work in Los Angeles, get people to think about the racial issues here in Los Angeles. And I remember the interview. He said, I'm. He kind of predicted a bloodbath during the summer. This was the summer of 1964. And it just happened that the article came out about the time of what is now called the Watts Riot. I would call it the Watts Rebellion, or the Los Angeles Rebellion.
yep.
And and that was and that brought a lot of attention to the group. But for me, it was something I liked doing. I liked the idea of getting over my shyness and going up to people and especially people involved in the civil rights movement and asking about them, about their background. What are they trying to achieve? And
I remember as a child, I was living in Northern California. I remember the Watts riots very, very well. It was a time where I think that the African Americans all over the country, obviously, this was happening not only in LA, but it was happening all over, were just they were fed up. And they were fed up with the injustice, certainly in the South. And you so beautifully talk about the whole Montgomery, but Rosa Parks. Did you know Rosa Parks, Dr. Carson?
um, not at that time. And all of these people I kind of read about in the newspaper,
Yeah,
and I delivered newspapers at that time, and actually sold magazines to sell to raise some money. And I often saw these articles about the civil rights movement. So I kind of knew their names,
yeah,
but one of the pleasures of my life was to get to meet people like Stokely Carmichael, um, uh, Ella Baker, all these names that have become familiar to me because now, I've done hours of interviews with them and they become acquaintances as well
yeah.
as historical characters for me.
So I remember that that time as being a time of great upheaval. Actually, there was great upheaval in the country in general. There was a lot of things, and we were right on the precipice of 1968, really, at that point in time. And there was a lot going on, that's for darn sure, including the Vietnam War, which was, revving up at that time. So, um, so that was what kind of got you into the you were interviewing people. Were you a history major at that point in time, Dr. Carson?
Yes, but I had focused on Latin American history. I had thought about going off. I my curiosity about the world outside Los Alamos was pretty general. I wanted to see the world, and so part of it was getting to know more about the United States, but
Yeah.
ultimately led to many trips to many parts of the world. I think now my count is over 30 countries that I've been to.
Wow. 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 You're very well traveled. So you ended up going to the a march. No, that was in 1963 or 64, did you say?
63 in August. And
Okay.
I was there by myself. It was being by yourself in a crowd of that large
Yeah.
is kind of a unique experience. But
So
it
you're
was
referring to the March on Washington.
a March on Washington. Yes,
So
I
you
I
were
don't.
part of that incredible crowd. that encircled the reflecting pool.
Yeah, I certainly could not have imagined getting to know Coretta King, you not a couple of decades later, we, began to work together. But I think if someone had told me that that anonymous person from New Mexico in the crowd is going to end up editing the papers of Martin Luther King, they would have said that's a crazy idea.
Like the guy, yeah. Well, you were a young kid. Who would have known?
Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, I want to kind of wind back a little bit, but while we're on that topic, that was probably one of the most seminal moments I think in the civil rights movement was that March on Washington, when Reverend King got up there and talked about the dream. He mentioned that dream, and I think that was almost a parenthetical comment, right? But I'm curious, what was it like to actually see Dr. King and deliver this speech because it was such a profound moment in American history?
Well, you don't get a chance to see a lot of oratory when you're growing up in a small town. And one of the things is that everybody there knew that Martin Luther King was going to deliver the concluding address. And that's one of the reasons why he gave the concluding address, because I found out later that uh, the question of who was going to deliver the final address, he responded to that by saying, "Who wants to follow me?" And that ended that discussion. And it was true that he was known even then as the great orator. So I think if you've been sitting in a crowd for a number of hours, you're looking forward to that speech,
Yeah,
and the fact that he delivered one of the great addresses in American history
that's right. So
was
did you
something.
know it? When you were listening to him, you must have been spellbound. And did you feel that sense of history? You're a historian. Did you feel that sense of history at the time that it was delivered?
Probably not. I was not a historian then. I was simply a young man in a crowd, and I had never met Martin Luther King. I'd never met uh, very many of the people at the march. Um, and if someone had told me, of all the things that would happen in my life later, I would not have believed it at that time. I thought it was just a unique event. I would go home and remember it as such. Uh, it didn't occur to me. It didn't occur to me at the time that this was going to be my career focus.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so just kind of winding back a little bit, I want to go back to the early days of Dr. King and his life. He was basically a church kid. He was his father was, of course, the famous, they called him Daddy King,
Yeah.
and he was the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church there in Atlanta, Georgia. But tell
And
us a
and
little bit
and his,
about
and his grandfather.
his grandfather too. You're exactly right. So his father, whose name is Martin Luther King too, he was I think the second member of the family. I think he was the son-in-law of the original pastor. Was it Williams? Was his name? Remind me.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And so Martin Luther King's father married the daughter of Pastor Williams at the
Right.
church, and then when he passed away, he took over the pastorship. Correct? Is that
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so Dr. King was really a church kid, and he lived in the church. He was deeply, deeply Christian. You can tell by the words that he wrote, and his method of speaking was very much. I think he probably learned a little bit of oratory by just going to church every week. Is that your impression too?
Yeah, but he was also a good writer, and I think that was very obvious when you started how many people publish articles when they're a student at Morehouse, or publish letters to the editor when they're a little bit older than that. And but he was someone who was a skilled writer, skilled speech maker,
Yeah.
sermon sermonizer, and I think that that reputation was something that led him to become involved in the movement. Because remember, he was not there when the movement started. Rosa Parks was,
Yeah.
and the question is, when she and the people supporting her deciding what are we going to do in response to this to stop segregation on the buses. Um, it was quite understandable that they would call Martin Luther King, not because he had the largest church in Montgomery, but they knew that he was articulate, he could mobilize support, and that's precisely what he did.
Yeah.
He became the spokesperson for the movement.
So Rosa Parks, when you talk about her, I mean, she's famous for the fact that she never got, stood up and gave up her seat. That was I think, in 1955. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that that sparked her. First of all, she got arrested, which I think it was the point that she wrote in this autobiography was, it was just she had come to the point where enough was enough, and she had enough personal respect that she was like done with it, done with the whole going, getting up and going to the back of the bus. And frankly, she was actually, I think she sat in the front of the bus, in a restricted area. I think it started with that. Is that? Can you tell us a little bit about the details of her story?
I, I think that she very purposefully made an effort to break the law, and I think that she had already talked about this with other people who, yeah, I mean, she was a civil rights proponent. So
Yeah,
it wasn't like somebody making a surprise decision someplace in their life, but rather someone who had thought about this. Anyone who ride. In fact, Martin Luther King himself had to ride segregated buses, and one of the reasons why his father made a point of driving him to school or having him driven to the school rather than use city buses, so they wouldn't have to face that. And so I think that for her it was a something that was degrading. It was something that she resented. She was a person whose husband was a civil rights activist, Raymond Parks. People don't mention that. Of course, I think another thing to mention is that Coretta King was a civil rights activist before she met Martin.
yeah.
It wasn't that he dragged her into the struggle. She was already a political activist during the Progressive Party movement. She had gone to the Progressive Party convention. Um, she was one who, when she met Martin, the question is who chose whom and for what reason, And I
Yeah.
think she, in a way, chose him because he showed those qualities that she admired.
He met her on the telephone. He made a phone call before he actually met her in person. I found that to be kind of an interesting, and he was kind of courting her on the telephone. Uh,
Yes,
but
definitely.
their courtship wasn't too long. They got married pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was one of the things about that is that when Daddy King found out about their relationship, he he suddenly changed from a skeptic to you guys need to get married as soon as possible, and, and he performed the marriage. I think the following June.
That's right. That's exactly right. So the his from Montgomery, Alabama. That was the beginning of the civil rights movement. Kind of walk us through the major steps that happened after Montgomery, because it took a while for the um, the Johnson administration to really pass the legislation. I think that was in '65, if I'm not mistaken. Uh,
Mhm.
where they really, the whole civil rights thing kind of at that point really kind of blew open. So can you walk us through those pivotal moments along the way?
Well, I think it's important to point out that the movement became much larger than simply Martin Luther King and much more larger than the Montgomery bus boycott. And in part, that was because of people like Fred Shuttlesworth, for example, in Birmingham. He knew immediately when he heard about the Montgomery bus boycott that he wanted to urge Martin Luther King to form a ministerial group, which became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was formed later on. And of course, the sit-ins by the students in 1960 was another stimulus that led to the formation of, well, initially as a uh, kind of a part of SCLC, but eventually becoming their own group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yep.
And so by the early 1960s, you had these two major organizations and lots of other less major groups that were fighting for civil rights. And you had many different, each of these different parts had their own strategy. The ministers in SCLC were focusing on the larger cities, trying to develop movements there. The students were often college-based, so they did sit-ins about segregated restaurants that they faced. Um, a lot of the students came out of those sit-ins, and eventually they made the decision to turn it into a freedom ride, where they would take a bus and try to integrate the facilities in interstate transportation, which, by the way, was supposedly against the law. You know that, but um, once they found that as they tried to practice integration in these bus stations, they would often be attacked, like they were in Montgomery and Birmingham in 1961. But all of that kind of came together as a movement with lots of different parts. I mean, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was one part, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was another, and of course the entire freedom struggle in the South depended on what state you were in. It kind of culminated in the Freedom Summer of 1964, where I thought about going to the South to join that aspect of the movement. But that summer of 64 was when the four civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi. And and of course, after that, the movement became even more intense as
Yeah.
it moved into the Deep South.
So was that the point that the cities of America blew up? Because was that Watts riots happened after the four workers were killed?
Would you repeat that? I got a phone call.
Sure. No, my question was the four civil rights workers who were killed, was that the igniting point of the Watts riots and the other riots across the nation? Because it wasn't only in Los Angeles, it was the entire nation basically became aflame with with riots. You remember that, I'm sure, well.
Well, I think what happened is that the people in the urban north, because by 1964 and 65, I'm in Los Angeles, and we're of course hearing about what's going on in the South. And that's what led, I mentioned Woody Coleman earlier about people to say, we need a civil rights movement here. We don't have jobs,
Yeah.
and there's no fair employment practices in Los Angeles. These are goals that need to be at the main focus of the struggles here in the urban north.
Yep.
And it's interesting for me that the first person I met in the Southern movement was Stokely Carmichael. But in 1965, I think it was, he came to Los Angeles. By that time, he's more well known, and he's coming with a message of the movement needs to be northern as well as southern.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of course, that was a major shift.
So you have really been part of the civil rights movement for really from the very beginning, in one way or the other. And over the years, it's been now what? It's been 60 years that we're talking about now. Your take on, I mean, this has been a very interesting recent history times, but your take on race relationships right now and the situation, I guess, the fruit that came out of the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation in the mid 60s. I mean, obviously, we have had a U.S. president, Barack Obama, who was elected and reelected, um, who was an African American. I don't think that would have ever been imagined when you were a kid, right? Am I right on saying that?
Definitely not.
Definitely
It
not. Uh, yeah, you wouldn't have imagined that. So, your observation of today's world, I'm very curious what you think about. Are we going forward? Or are we going backwards?
I think it's still to be decided. I really believe that if you read Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? He talks about that. He
Yeah,
says, writing that book in 1967, and he doesn't see the end of the struggle at that point because by that time he understands that number one, it's a struggle over resources and equality. It's not just a struggle about segregation at a lunch counter. It's a struggle about how our society is structured. Is it fair? Do we have, are we coming closer to equality or just reinforcing inequalities? And that's something that you could ask on a global level also, because on in the year he died, 1968, could be seen as the start of major American participation in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and increasingly involving uh, the formerly colonized people of the world. So, so what starts out as kind of a movement in Montgomery by the end of the 1960s is really more of a global movement. And that's one of the reasons why I've stopped using the term civil rights so much, because it really pushes us to look back at a time when civil rights goals were the major goal.
yeah,
And I think by the end of King's career, he would have said it's human rights. It's the rights we have as people as opposed to citizens of one particular country. And I think that's where we are today, is still trying to work out whether those human rights mean anything. And that's something that I see as one of the central aspects of the 20th century. That struggle is far from over.
yeah. No, I can't agree with you more. And I think that, listen, I think that I happen to be of Christian persuasion. I do think that human beings were made in the image of God. That's a biblical, that's from Genesis, by the way. And I do think, and I do a lot of medical mission trips, Dr. Carson. I was just in Liberia a couple of months ago doing a medical mission trip. And even there, I mean, this whole idea of human rights and actually racism too is very evident even in Africa. You know that there are groups of people who don't like other groups of people. The Hutus and the Tutsis fight each other, and there is kind of a race that is a racial issue as much as anything. And tribal, of course, and tribal is kind of a brother to racism, as you well know. But I think that this is going to be. I do think that racism is one of these things that is deep in the heart of human beings, and to root it out is not an easy task.
I didn't, I would think that Martin Luther King would definitely agree that this is not an easy struggle. when he is writing his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He means those words, chaos or community, literally. He's talking about a world house in which we all live in societies where equality, and I guess fair treatment, all the things that we value in terms of equitable society. Uh, the United States is not the only society that falls short of the goal. You
Yeah.
know, obviously the world falls short of the goal. Um, and one of the things I would just go back to in terms of my own background growing up in Los Alamos, I understood how the atomic bomb ended World War II. I think that we don't want to have World War III fought over the same kinds of issues because in today's world, a world war might, I think Oppenheimer put it when he said that the World War III will be fought with sticks and stones. And what he meant was that that'll be all that's left.
Mhm.
And I think that that's the danger that we face is that we're we're dealing with a fragile world. We're dealing with ideals that are still in development. I I have this hope that whatever routes that we take in our own individual countries, that part of perfecting our societies is dealing with that question of human rights. Because I can't imagine a really just society in which, people who are citizens are treated fine, people who are not citizens are treated terribly. That kind of a society, as far as I'm concerned, is not going to last very long because the world is becoming a place where people travel. Um, there, what happens in one country can affect what happens in other countries. We see that every day. So I think we need to develop a new framework, and it's Martin Luther King helped us develop that. I mean, he was one of those who argued for changing the terminology from civil rights to human rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
No,
I think that,
he obviously, when the legislation was passed, it didn't always mean that it was enacted in a fair way. We knew that from the Reconstruction days after the Civil War, which was 100 years, before this time, of course, and that was a time of incredible oppression. To Even though the laws were on the books, the Constitution had been changed. It was still it hadn't really made its way out to the two people. Um, I think we all struggle with this, and I think as an American, I certainly want to believe that the opportunities and justice is meted out across the board equally. I can't imagine a civilization or a country where that would not be the case. And certainly opportunities. I mean, this country has been certainly good to me as a as a individual, and good to you too. I mean, I think about the kid from Los Alamos. Here you are. What an amazing lifetime you've had. You're a professor emeritus at Stanford University. You've done okay for yourself as a kid from Los Alamos. So the opportunities have availed themselves to you as to me too. I feel very, very blessed by the opportunities I've had. So I think we strive for that. And so another question. I'm just watching our time here. I don't want to. I'm going to be honest with my time with you, but we have this is today is we're honoring Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Why why should we honor him? What are the compelling reasons? If you walked into a room and people had never heard of him before, and you said, okay, listen, here's a man that is worthy of honor. What are the attributes that you would see in him that you would articulate to those who may not know him?
I think persistence, the way in which he identified what one of the major problems of American society and I guess world society as a whole, and had dedicated his life to try to resolve them. And that's what makes his writing so interesting is that that continues to the end of his life. He's concerned about issues that are very much with us. Certainly poverty. Uh, he he it was not that he retired from the movement. I think that if he had lived longer, he would have been more continued to be active in the movement because he was, I have recordings of and films of the last meetings he had with his colleagues, and he talks about it. You know, he had no idea that 1968 would be his last date. That was the surprise. He looked forward to a long-term struggle. He told Bernard Lafayette that the struggle needs to be internationalized. He was just beginning to do that. And that's one of the unfortunate things about not having him around is that we often see him in this past tense as, you know, when I talk to students, many of whom whose grandparents weren't even alive during the time of the March on Washington, and I'm teaching them courses that look at Martin Luther King as simply a historical character. It would be kind of like teaching about Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century and just saying, well, let's just look at the his life, not his impact over time. What does it mean for today?
Right.
And that's why I think a book like um, the books that I've done on him continues to sell. The autobiography of Martin Luther King was written in the 1990s. So I was clearly thinking of a 20th century audience who would be interested in the life of Martin Luther King, and
Yeah.
it sold well. So I think that indicates that his life still has relevance today, and that's one of the reasons why I think Coretta King succeeded in getting it as a national holiday. It's not often that our protest leaders become national holidays, but that was one of her successes.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a pretty gigantic success to actually close down banks and shut down the entire country for a national holiday. And to her credit, that's amazing. And by the way, you're right. Your book was published, I think, in 1997, and here I am in 2024 picking it up for the first time, and I will tell you, friends of those who are listening who may not have read this book, it is called The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. It is edited by our guest today, Dr. Clayborne Carson, Carson. It is, by the way, a wonderfully written book. I haven't finished it, I will be honest, but I'm planning on finishing it because, if nothing else, I'm finding a tremendous amount of inspiration by the quotes from Reverend Martin Luther King, who was, I think, I would also characterize him as being incredibly courageous, a visionary, certainly an orator, as you mentioned, but he was a man who was in amazingly focused and dedicated to the cause of freedom. Freedom, certainly for the African Americans at that time, but also really, I think that it spilled over. Um, my feeling was early on he did have a little bit of angst about white Americans. Can you speak to that a little bit and how I think he overcame that over a period of time?
I think that's not something I see as a major aspect of his character. I mean, he was a friendly person. Uh,
Yeah.
his his friendships were widespread, And I think there were people in the movement who became embittered over race. I don't think that Martin Luther King was like that. I think there were always people who were his colleagues who were of different races. And and that's something that I will also say about Coretta King. Her political involvement was with the Progressive Party. So you might know that the Progressive Party was putting forward civil rights uh, legislation as being part of their platform. They were concerned about a lot of these issues in the late 40s and early 1950s. Now, trying to start a third party, a leftist third party, is hard in the United States, and she found that out. But I think the fact that she was so interested in it and in some ways took the lead in terms of getting Martin to broaden his concerns, because you might know that Coretta King from the early 1960s became very much involved in the movement against nuclear weapons, became wanted to stop nuclear uh, testing in the
Yes.
atmosphere.
Yeah. No, I'm aware of that. She became pretty much an anti nuclear person, and I'm very aware of that. Yep.
And she was also one of the people who were very first involved in the effort to stop the war in Vietnam. And this was several years before Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in 1967. But she was already doing that. She was speaking at Madison Square Garden against the war in 1965.
Well,
So, and she was a member of a group called Women's International Strike for Peace. That was a longstanding organization. And uh, it's interesting to me when I look at the conversations between the two, you know, uh, because she has a schedule. She has to tell Martin, yes, I'm going to give a speech in San Francisco, or I'm going to give a speech at Madison Square Garden, and all of these. And he, of course, is talking about his speeches, and and it became the case that both of them were competing for time. I guess that would be
yeah. They were an activist couple. What can we say? Busy people. Well, listen, Dr. Carson, I'm going to finish it off here. I just want to say, first of all, to everyone listening, today's an important day. Today's an important day to really sit down and, number one, learn a little bit more about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. if you don't know much about him. We can't let his memory fade, number one. And number two, I think that when you get to know this man, and I will tell you, I'm learning things by reading your book, Dr. Carson, about him that I didn't know. Uh, you will appreciate that this was a man of conviction, and the leadership ability that he had is unbelievable as well. He was clearly a leader, and people looked up to him, people followed him, and I do think that his influence was what pushed this whole movement forward. So this is a day to think about the man, Martin Luther King Jr., remarkable man, and it's more than a parade. Is more than just a day off. It should be a day of reflection. And so, thank you for educating us, Dr. Carson. You have written a beautiful book.
Could I just add one little thing to that, and that is, I just hope that people celebrate his birthday by looking ahead, not looking backward. That it's one thing to admire him as a historical figure who did a lot, but I think to me the most important message is his last message: the struggle is not over, and it continues today.
Well put. Very, very good admonition. Okay, well, friends, you have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. It has been an incredible pleasure to welcome distinguished Professor Dr. Clayborne Carson, Emeritus Professor of History at Stanford University, as our guest. He is also the editor of the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., I would recommend that you pick it up. It is available. It was very easy for me to find. And I am so honored, Dr. Carson, to have you. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
And friends, until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.